I Will Never Cheat on a School Paper Again by KGLewis. It all began 5 days ago. I was sitting in biology class, listening to Mr. Grissom drone on and on about mitosis and meiosis. I don't know why the class was a requirement for my degree. My major was computer programming. I didn't want to be a doctor or a chemist. What did cell division have anything to do with computer coding? I sat and fought the urge to fall asleep as he continued to lecture. The fact that he spoke in a monotonous tone only made it harder for me to stay awake. It didn't matter what he was talking about, his tone never changed. He would raise the volume of his voice or lower it, depending on the background noise, but that's the most variation I've ever heard come from him. He sounded like a robot. Once my 45-minute prison sentence was up, I grabbed my stuff and I quickly headed for the door. But Warden Grissom wasn't ready to let us go free. He made everyone return to their seats. "I can't stress how important cell division is for biological systems," he said, raising his voice to be heard above the closing folders and zipping backpacks. "That's why I want each of you to write a 5-page paper detailing the different stages of mitosis and meiosis as well as the differences between the two." The assignment got a collective groan from the class, but the worst was yet to come. "They are due first thing Wednesday morning," he finished. 2 days. He was giving us only 2 days to write a detailed paper about something that we had just learned about. "Oh, and one last thing," he called out as the class shuffled out the door. "Make sure to double-check your spelling and grammar. It counts for 1/3 of your grade." I left the building, walking across the campus to my computer class. I couldn't believe that he was going to grade us on spelling and grammar. It was bad enough that we had to write a 5-page paper in 2 days. By the end of the day, the biology paper was the last thing on my mind. After my programming class, I had to go to work. And by the time that the shift ended, I was exhausted. All I wanted to do was go to sleep. I decided to write the paper in the morning. I didn't have any classes and could give it my full attention. I woke just before noon, as I always did on the morning that I had free. I got up and I browsed the internet for a while. I didn't forget about the biology paper. I just wasn't ready to tackle it yet. This was my day off from classes and I wanted to enjoy as much of it as I could. But before I knew it, it was 2 p.m. I hadn't realized that I was on the internet for so long. I only had 3 hours to write the paper before I had to go to work. I grabbed my biology book and started to read the chapter on cell division. I felt like I was trying to learn a foreign language. The fact that I found the subject incredibly boring didn't help. It was hopeless. There was no way I was going to be able to write a 5-page paper in 3 hours. I suppose that I could stay up after work, I thought to myself. But who was I kidding? My brain is fried after work. There was no way that I could write a coherent paper in the middle of the night after standing on my feet flipping burgers for 8 hours. Desperate, I did what any college student in my situation would do. Well, at least those college students who hated the subject of their paper as much as I did. I searched the internet for a paper that I could copy. For the record, this was the first time that I ever cheated like this. And if I had known what would happen, I wouldn't have done it. If I survive, I know I certainly won't do it again. While I was looking for a paper to use, I came to the conclusion that I had to find one that wouldn't show up on many search engines. I also had to find one that would be considered a C paper. I know my limits, and so did Mr. Grissom. If I showed up with an A paper, he would be suspicious. Being a computer geek, I knew some people who could point me in the right direction. It would only take me a couple of emails. I checked for a response several times over the next 3 hours, hoping to hear from one of my friends. By the time I left for work, I hadn't received a single reply. I would be lying if I said I wasn't worried. However, the people I was asking tended to be night owls, so I still had hope that one of them would get back to me. Work sucked as usual. The night seemed to drag on for forever. Once I got home, I turned on my laptop and checked my email. There was only one message waiting for me. Sender unknown, it said in the address field. In the subject field was just the word paper. When I opened the email, the only thing it contained was a hyperlink. I clicked on the link, which caused a new window to pop up. I watched as the status bar at the bottom of the window changed from establishing a connection to connected. The link took me directly to a Word document that contained a 5-page paper written on the subject of mitosis and meiosis. I read through it to make sure that it covered all the relevant points. There were a couple of things missing, but I was okay with that. I was only trying to get a C anyways. Satisfied that the paper would serve my purposes, I pressed the print button. The printer whirled into life and began noisily producing the first page. Once it was done, I looked over to see if it printed okay, only to find that the page was blank. I tried printing it several more times, but the pages remained blank every time. There must have been a code embedded in the document that prevented me from printing it. I knew that my printer wasn't out of ink. I had replaced the cartridge last week, and I hadn't used it all that much. I was tired, and I didn't feel like trying to crack the code so that I could print it out. I decided that it would be faster and probably seem a little more authentic if I wrote it out by hand. So that's what I did. When I was done, I wrote my name at the top of the paper and I placed it in my backpack. And then I went to sleep, or at least I tried to. I had no trouble falling asleep. It was staying asleep that was the problem. My room was unusually cold that night. I woke up in the middle of the night shivering. I got up and I checked all of the windows in my dorm room, but none of them were open. I even checked the thermostat. It read 72 degrees, which couldn't be right. I eventually put on a sweatshirt and some jogging pants and I went back to bed. I was annoyed to hear the alarm clock go off a few hours later. It couldn't possibly be time to get up, but unfortunately, it was. I dragged myself out of bed and into the kitchen. I needed coffee, and lots of it. When I turned on the light, I could swear that it was not as bright as it once was. And, come to think of it, the light in my bedroom didn't seem all that bright either. I thought something must be up with the electricity. After I finished my second cup of coffee, I grabbed my backpack and I headed to school. I didn't bother to shower or change. There wasn't anyone there that I was trying to impress. Promptly at 8 a.m., Mr. Grissom began his lecture. I glanced around the classroom and I saw several students furiously scribbling away at what must have been their papers. None of them were paying any attention to what he was saying. I'm glad I wasn't one of them. At 8:45, Mr. Grissom ended his lecture and asked the class to leave their papers on his desk on the way out. I dropped mine on the top of the stack and I left. I was glad that that little ordeal was over. At least, I thought that it was over. But it was just the beginning. When I returned home later that afternoon, I was annoyed to discover that my electricity problem hadn't cleared up and there was still a chill in the air. I was even more annoyed to find out I was going to have to put in a work order to get the maintenance guy to come and find out what the problem was. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, intending to call maintenance, when I noticed that I had a voicemail. I unlocked my phone and clicked the play button and listened to Mr. Grissom's monotonous voice come from the speaker. "Hello, Charles," he said. I hated being called Charles. It sounded so formal. "I'm calling in regards to your paper. It is extremely urgent that you contact me as soon as you get my message. You can reach me at 555-0121. I will be in the office until 6. My stomach dropped. I was sure Mr. Grissom had somehow found out the truth about my paper. I couldn't afford to get an F. My brain raced through a dozen different excuses that I could use to get another chance at writing the paper. Each one an elaborate lie designed to buy me more time. Lies that he had probably heard 1,000 times before as a teacher. When the message ended, I dialed Mr. Grissom's number. The sooner I got this over with, the better. I was just going to tell him the truth. I didn't have enough time between work and school to write the paper. He answered the phone on the third ring. "Hi, Mr. Grissom. This is Charlie. I just got your message." "Charles, I'm so glad you called." He sounded a little worried. "You have to come to my office. There's something important that I need to show you. Your life depends on it." My life? I couldn't help but begin to laugh. I found it hard to believe that my life was in danger over a paper that I had copied. "This is no laughing matter. By writing this paper, you have put yourself in a dangerous position." "What are you talking about?" I was starting to feel like he might be threatening me. "I cannot explain over the phone. Please come by my office." He was beginning to sound a little bit distressed. "Well, I can't right now. I have to go to work," I lied. I didn't have to go to work. He was just creeping me out. There was no way that I was going to meet him alone in his office. Hey, how about we just discuss this on Friday after class?" "Well, you may not have that much time, Charles. Please come in," he pleaded. "I'll be fine, Mr. Grissom. Look, I gotta go. I'll talk to you on Friday." I quickly tapped the end call icon. I was dumbfounded. What was he talking about? How could a paper put my life in danger? I think that his life was going to be in danger if he kept talking to people like that. I went into my bedroom and I turned on the laptop. Since I didn't have to work that night, I decided to catch up on some programming assignments. The moment I sat down, my phone began to ring. I had a good idea who it was and I let the call go to voicemail. I listened to the message once I got the alert. As expected, it was Mr. Grissom. He pleaded with me to listen to him. That afternoon, he left me a dozen messages on my phone. In the last message that he left, he promised to give me an A for the paper if I would just stop by his office for 15 minutes. That was a very tempting offer. The highest grade I had ever gotten in his class was a B-. I had to admit, I was curious to hear what he thought was so important. I'm sure it was something stupid, probably along the lines of how I wasn't going to get very far in life if I kept copying other people's papers. After an hour of manipulating code, I decided I had done enough homework for one day. I glanced over at the clock and noticed that it was only 5 p.m. I still had time to go see Mr. Grissom about the paper and get my A. I thought about it for a few minutes, and then I decided that I would go and see what was so important. It was 5:30 when I arrived. I walked into the teacher's wing of the science department and over to Mr. Grissom's office. His door was open, so I knocked on the frame to get his attention. He glanced up, startled by the sudden noise. "Charles," he said. He was obviously surprised to see me. "I didn't think you'd come. I know I must have sounded like a madman on the phone. Please forgive me." "Oh, don't worry about it," I said. "I'm so glad you came. Please sit down." He gestured to the chair in front of me. "I have something to show you." I sat down and waited as he searched his desk for whatever he was wanting to show me. "I just had it," he said as he tossed a stack of papers onto the floor. "Ah, here it is." He held the handwritten pages out to me. I looked them over. It wasn't my handwriting. It wasn't even my paper. This isn't my paper." I tried to hand the pages back to him. "I know it's not," he said, refusing to take the papers from me. "I want you to look at that paper, then compare it to yours, which is right here." He paused after each word, using the time to search his cluttered desk for my paper. Once he found it, he handed it to me and then motioned for me to read it. I read the first paper he had handed me, and then I read mine. Other than that, both papers were very poorly written. I didn't see any similarities. They weren't even on the same subject. I placed the papers on his desk to let him know that I was finished. "I don't know what I'm supposed to see," I said. "They were both handwritten and sloppy." "Yes, they are, but that isn't the problem," he said. I stared at him, not knowing where he was going with all of this. He took the first page of my paper and set it off to the side. Then he took a book and placed it on top of the paper so that only the first letter of each line was visible. "What does your paper say now?" he asked. I looked at the row of letters. At first they looked like a long line of gibberish, but then I was able to make out a series of words. "Read it out loud," Mr. Grissom said when I looked up at him. "Those who choose the path." He replaced the first page of my paper with the second page when I finished reading and then said, "Continue." "Of the cheat by signing," I read. He replaced the second page with the third. I read on. "Their name, thy end they." The third page was replaced by the fourth. "Will meet." The rest of the words were in a language that I didn't recognize, and they continued until the last line of the fifth page. Mr. Grissom picked up the first paper and handed it to me. "The same thing is written along the margins of this paper." "Well, how is that possible?" I asked him. "Did you happen to see who wrote this?" He indicated the pages that he was holding. "No, I just knew that it wasn't mine. I had never bothered to check who wrote it." "Are you familiar with the name Dustin Walker?" I had to admit that the name did seem familiar to me. I just couldn't remember where I had heard it. "Maybe this will help your memory," Mr. Grissom said as he pulled out a newspaper off his desk and put it in front of me. All I had to do was read the headline, and then I remembered why the name sounded so familiar. "College student found dismembered in dorm room," the headline read. 3 years ago, a student named Dustin Walker was found murdered in his dorm room. I was in high school at the time. It was all that the news talked about for weeks. They never caught the murderer. "Yeah, I remember now," I said. "Do you think that's what got him killed?" I pointed at Dustin Walker's paper. "I do, and I hope that you will too once you hear me out." He paused for a moment as he gauged my reaction. When I didn't get up and leave, he continued, "What I am going to tell you is going to sound crazy, but you have to believe me. I am only trying to help Charles." "Okay," I said. I didn't know what else to say. And then I remembered his promise. "I'm still getting an A on that. You promised, right?" "Absolutely," he said. "In fact, if you survive this, I will make sure that you pass my class." I had every intention of surviving and passing that class. I just hoped that this wasn't going to turn into some weird kind of proposition. I still didn't trust him, but I was unsettled enough by the hidden words on my paper to hear him out. 3 days before he died, Dustin turned in that paper. At the time, I treated it like I did all written assignments. I graded it, and I filed it away. It wasn't until a few weeks after his death that I would pull the paper out and discover the hidden message written upon it. An officer assigned to the case came by my office to ask a few questions about Dustin. They had no leads and were talking to everyone who had had contact with him in hopes that something would turn up. Before he left, the officer asked me if I knew someone named Stephen Summers. I told him that I had never heard the name before, and then he left. Curious, I did a little research and I discovered that Stephen's body had been found in the same condition as Dustin's, in the same dorm building, but 10 years earlier. The next day, I went to the admissions office and I got a copy of Stephen's transcript. I don't really know why I did that. I think I was just trying to help Dustin by looking for any similarities between the two deaths. Dustin was a good student, and what happened to him was a tragedy. Of all of the teachers listed on Stephen's transcripts, only one of the teachers still worked for the university, an English professor. I went and I talked to her to see if she remembered anything about Stephen's death, but she couldn't recall anything. She did, however, claim to have a file with all of his work in it. I asked her if I could borrow the file. I told her a friend of mine on the force was looking into some old case and that I was giving him a hand. She didn't mind, so I took the file and I went back to my office. As I was looking through the English papers written by Stephen, I had a student stop by to ask me a few questions about an upcoming assignment. As we talked, I placed one of my textbooks on the desk to explain something to the student. After she left, I closed the book and was about to return it to my shelf when I noticed the paper sitting underneath it. The book was lying on top of it in such a way that only the letters on the left-hand side of the paper were visible. That was when I noticed that the letters formed a series of words that continued across the left-hand margin of every page. The same series of words that are on every page of your paper. Curious, I pulled out Dustin's folder and I went through the papers that he had written for me. I found the same words along the margin of the last paper that he turned in to me. There were now 3 things that Dustin had in common. The first thing was that they died in the same way. The second thing was that they died in the same building. The third thing was that they turned in handwritten papers that contained the same secret message written along the margin. He fixed his eyes on mine and pointed at me. You have 2 things in common with both of them. I have to admit, it was a pretty freaky coincidence, but was that really enough to think that I was going to die a horrible death? That's it? I asked him. Isn't it enough? He couldn't believe that I wasn't taking him seriously. I mean, it sounds like the plot of a campy horror movie or a bad joke. Seriously, how can a bunch of words on a piece of paper kill me? I asked him. It's not just words on a paper. It's a curse. The look on his face told me that he was completely committed to this idea. It took me a while, but I was able to find someone who recognized and was able to translate the language used in the second half of the message. I held up my hand to stop him from going off on a tangent about how he translated the words. Hearing the story of how he discovered the hidden message was bad enough. Okay. How do I stop whatever is going to happen from happening? I asked him. I didn't believe anything he was saying. I just wanted to get out of there and still be able to get my A. He smiled. I know it's hard to believe, but this is too big a coincidence to take a chance on. Okay, just tell me what I need to do. I hoped that it didn't involve another story. Now, I'm not 100% certain that this will work, but it's the best option that we have. Well, the sooner you tell me, the sooner I can get started, I told him. You're going to have to rewrite the paper, but you are going to have to do so in a way that works a counter curse into the margin, he said. I assume that you have the counter curse, right? I asked him. I do, he said, as he reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out a post-it note with several foreign-looking words on it. You will need to come up with an opening limerick, like the ones used in the original curse, one that explains your intent, he said. You don't have one, I said. No, I figured it would be easier for you to come up with your own as you were writing it. That would give you more freedom. Okay, so wait a second. This isn't some elaborate hoax to get me to rewrite the paper, is it? I'm serious, Charles. This isn't a joke. Rewrite the paper with the counter curse worked into the margin, and I will give you an A for the entire semester. I wasn't going to sit there and argue against that. You've got yourself a deal, I said, and I stood up to leave. You might want to take this with you, he said as he handed me my original paper as I walked out of the office. I didn't go home. Instead, I went to the computer lab and I rewrote the paper as instructed. It was much easier to work the counter curse into the margins when I could use the word program to look up alternate words that started with the letters that I needed. When I was finished, I printed the paper out, signed my name at the top, and headed back to my dorm room. When I got home, I opened my door and I flipped on the light switch. When the lights came on, they put out about as much light as a candle. I flipped the switch on and off a few times, hoping that it would fix the problem, but it didn't. I tried the light switch in the bathroom, and it was the same. As if it wasn't bad enough, my room had gotten colder, despite the thermostat showing the temperature to be 74 degrees. I knew that it was much colder than that because I could see the misty plume of my breath whenever I exhaled. I grabbed a couple of blankets from my bed, and I sat down on my couch to watch some television before calling it a night. I tried to get the heater to work, but I gave up after I could only get it to blow cold air. I must have been pretty tired because I dozed off on the couch. My sleep was restless as the events of the day worked their way into my dreams, turning them into a nightmare. In my dream, I walked into my dorm room to find a tall, thin creature in the process of dismembering someone. The creature's body was completely black and glistened like oil in the light. When I entered the room, it dropped the remains of the person it was holding and turned to face me. Its single white eye swam in its face as it focused on me, never staying in the same place for more than a second. Before I could turn and run, its arms shot forth, stretching as they came at me and wrapped themselves around my body. I tried to pry myself loose from its grip, but my hands just sank into its flesh-like soft clay. It started to pull me forward, lifting me off the ground as it did so. Once my feet were dangling above the floor, two new arms formed out of the creature's chest. They grabbed hold of my legs and started to pull them apart. It was trying to rip me in half. It was at that moment that I woke up and I cried out. Mr. Grissom's story was obviously getting to me. My subconscious had created a boogeyman to go along with everything else that he had told me. I didn't sleep anymore that night. I just stayed up and watched television. I was too afraid that I would have that dream again. It was so vivid. I swear I could still feel the pressure of the creature's grip on my legs. At 7:30 a.m., I went into my bedroom and I got dressed, and then I went to class. I could see the concern on Mr. Grissom's face as I walked into his classroom. I must have looked terrible. "Are you okay, Charles?" he asked, pulling me out into the hall. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said. "My apartment is freezing. My lights barely shine. I slept maybe 2 hours last night thanks to the nightmare that you gave me. And, according to you, something is going to kill me. So yeah, I'm fine." He stared at me like I was crazy. "Did you rewrite the paper?" he asked. I pulled out the rewritten paper and handed it to him. "What is this?" He looked at the paper like it was something dirty. "It's the paper," I said. "I thought you were going to rewrite it," he said. "I did," I told him. "I meant by hand, Charles." "What's the difference?" I asked, clearly not understanding. "This paper is nothing but the end result of a bunch of zeros and ones processed by a computer. If we are dealing with something supernatural, this has no meaning to it. These words have the power to protect you, but only when written by hand. You have to redo this paper in your own handwriting." "No way," I said. "Please, Charles, go home and rewrite the paper," he said as he handed the pages back to me. He went back into the classroom, and I stood there trying to decide what to do. I went back to my dorm. It took me 3 hours in the low light and chilly temperature, but I did it. I rewrote the entire paper by hand. I read through it a couple of times just to make sure that everything lined up like it was supposed to, and that the message I had written into the margin was complete. It was. Eager to get this over with, I took the paper over to Mr. Grissom's office. He was busy talking to another student, so I just held up the paper for him to see, and I put it in the plastic file holder hanging on the wall next to his door. He nodded and then returned his attention to the student sitting across from him. Now that that ordeal was over, it was time to focus on my other homework. I went back to my dorm and I pulled out my notebook and I flipped through it, making sure that I was caught up with all of my other classes. Crap, I thought, when I pulled out my assignment sheet from my English class. I had completely forgotten about the creative writing assignment we were given a few weeks ago. It was due tomorrow. I briefly considered copying a paper from the internet, but I decided that I didn't want to go through that ordeal again. Instead, I started to write this story about everything that had happened to me when I made a mistake of trying to cheat. The lesson had been learned. Right after I finished writing the paragraph above this one, my phone rang. It was Mr. Grissom. "Hello," I said. I'm sure that he could hear the annoyance in my voice. "Charles, you need to get over here right now," he said. I didn't answer him. I stared through the open door of my bathroom, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Charles," Mr. Grissom's voice didn't register in my mind. A viscous black liquid was spewing out of the shower head and collecting in the tub. "Charles!" Mr. Grissom yelled through the phone. "What?" My voice sounded distant to me. "You forgot to put your name on the paper!" Mr. Grissom screamed. I watched in horror as the liquid began to coalesce and rise out of the tub as it took the form of the creature from my nightmare. I dropped the phone when that familiar eye appeared in the creature's head. I ran out of the dorm and I didn't stop until I made it to Mr. Grissom's office. I snatched the papers from his hand, grabbed one of the pens off his desk, and I signed my name to the top of the page. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't ever want to find out. I will never cheat again. But to end this story on a positive note, I got an A on my creative writing assignment. The teacher thought that my story was very original and believable.